47 years and she still gave you that? The woman pointed at my wedding ring. She laughed. My husband replaced mine twice, she said. Some men simply can't afford to keep their wives happy. Her husband chuckled. Didn't even look up. Looked down at my ring. Scratched. Dull. 47 years old. Margaret never asked me to replace it, I said. She smiled. Maybe she should have. My face burned. I said nothing. I thought the ring proved I hadn't given Margaret enough. I'd thought that for 47 years. Then the jeweler reached for my hand. May I see that ring? I took it off. First time in 47 years. He turned it over and froze. Not the way a man reacts to something expensive. The way a man reacts to something familiar. I've seen this mark before, he said quietly. What mark? He didn't answer. He grabbed a loupe instead, pressed it to his eye. Studied the inside of the band for a long, long moment. Mr. Miller. Where? Did your wife get this? She had it made, I said. Arthur shook his head slowly. Not exactly. He turned the ring over again. Your wife had this ring made from something that already existed. I stared at him. I don't understand. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to almost nothing. Your wife came here 3 years ago. My heart stopped. Margaret? He nodded. She asked me to hide something inside this ring. 47 years, and I had no idea it was carrying a message. One my wife had left for me to find only after she was gone. But to understand why that ring mattered so much to Margaret, you have to go back to the beginning. I met Margaret at a diner where she worked weekends. I was a mechanic's apprentice, broke and covered in grease most days. She came from money. Her father owned a manufacturing company across town. One night, after a terrible day at the garage, she caught me staring across the street at a jewelry store. What are you looking at? A ring. For who? Hypothetically? She laughed. You're a terrible liar, Frank. Her father did not approve of me. He called me into his study one evening, a room bigger than my apartment. If you marry my daughter, he said, she'll spend the rest of her life making sacrifices for you. Then I'll spend the rest of mine making... Sure, she never regrets it, I said. He studied me a long moment. Then he opened a drawer and slid an envelope across the desk. Cash. More than I made in a year. Leave her, he said. She'll forget you by spring. I left the envelope on the desk and walked out. I never told Margaret about that conversation. Not for 47 years. He didn't come to the wedding. I looked toward the back of the church anyway, hoping. He never showed. 32 people in those pews. When it was time to exchange rings, I froze, looking at the little gold band in my palm. Suddenly ashamed of it, Margaret noticed. Frank, she whispered, look at me. Not the ring. I'm sorry it's not more, I said. I didn't marry the ring. She held out her hand. Put it on me. I did. $83 of gold. Every cent I had left. I thought that was the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Our first apartment had one window that didn't close all the way, and a landlord who never fixed anything. Our first Christmas, we couldn't afford a tree, so Margaret cut branches from a pine behind the building and stood them in a coffee can. It's better than a tree, she said. A tree we'd have had to buy. I didn't understand yet how deliberately she was choosing that life. Her mother called that winter, invited her home for the holidays, alone, without me. Margaret said no without a second's pause. You could have gone, I told her later. Seen your family. It wouldn't have hurt anything. Frank, she said, I am home. Our first winter, the heat broke twice. We couldn't afford to fix it right, so I picked up overtime nobody wanted. Night shifts, weekend calls, anything. Margaret figured it out before I told her. She always did. A few weeks later, her jewelry box was lighter. An emerald necklace her father had given her. Gone. I assumed she'd lost it. I was afraid of the answer, so I didn't ask. Months later, going through the bills, I found the truth. She'd sold it, paid 2 months of rent, and never said a word. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She shrugged. Because you'd have spent the next 10 years trying to buy it back. You should have. I didn't lose anything, Frank. She smiled. I invested in us. I wouldn't understand what she meant for another 40 years. 8 months into the marriage, I lost my job. The garage cut half its mechanics. I was young on the list, first to go. I didn't tell her right away. I sat in the car outside our building for 2 hours, trying to figure out how to say it. When I finally came in, she took one. Look at me. How was work? Fine. She looked at me for 3 seconds. Frank? What? Don't lie to me. I sat down at the table. They let me go. I braced for the panic. Instead, she just nodded slowly. Good. I stared at her. Good? Now you can stop spending your life proving something to people who don't matter. Ah. Week later, I found out she'd turned down a promotion of her own. Another city. Double the salary. Never told me it existed. You were already worried about being enough for me, she said when I finally confronted her. I wasn't going to hand you proof I could do better without you. She took my hand. You were always enough, Frank. Years passed. 2 kids. A house we grew into slowly. 38 years fixing city buses instead of cars. What I didn't know all those years was that her father hadn't disappeared entirely. He'd simply stopped speaking to us directly. Every so often, word would reach us in strange ways. A mutual acquaintance mentioning he'd asked how the Miller family was doing, a doctor's bill for our daughter's tonsils that came back marked paid before we could send a check. We never traced it to him. I never let myself hope it was him. I told Margaret it was probably a mistake at the billing office. She just looked at me for a long moment and said nothing. I found out later she'd known exactly who it was. She simply never told me because she knew I'd have refused it. I got better at the work, started making real money by our 15th year. I still didn't fully believe her. On our 25th anniversary, I tried to replace the ring, saved for 6 months. Didn't tell her, took her to a jewelry store after dinner. She knew immediately what I'd done. Looked at the display. 10 seconds? You saved for this? 6 months. She shook her head. Frank, take me home. In the car, she held my hand. Do you know what I see when I look at that ring? Something cheap? 47 years of mornings. 47 years of arguments. 47 years of you coming home. She looked at me. It's not about what you could afford, Frank. It's about what we lived through. I never tried again. A few years after that, out of nowhere, she said something strange. If I could change one thing about our life, she said, I'd make you understand what that ring actually means. I laughed. It's a wedding ring, Margaret. She looked down at my hand for a long moment. No, Frank, it's our life. She didn't explain. She just changed the subject, the way she always did when she'd said more than she meant to. I let it go. I've thought about that sentence every day since I stood in Arthur's store. About 3 years. Before she got too sick to leave the house, I caught her on the phone in the kitchen. She hung up fast when she saw me. Who was that? Someone from a jewelry store. I laughed. What would you possibly need from a jewelry store? She looked down at my hand, at the ring. Just taking care of something, she said, and wouldn't say another word. 11 years before she died, Margaret first got sick. It moved slowly at first. Good years mixed with bad ones. We still had our Sunday mornings, coffee on the porch, the crossword she always finished, and I never did. Then, slowly, the good years thinned out. Near the very end, she couldn't walk without help. I got used to a new rhythm, one arm around her waist, hers gripping my forearm, both of us pretending it was nothing. One night, easing her into bed, she grabbed my hand. Frank, do you regret marrying me? Margaret, no, never. Because I've never regretted marrying you. Not for one single day. She touched the ring. Promise me something. Anything. When someone tells you this ring wasn't worth much, don't believe them, I promised. I didn't fully understand what she meant. A few nights later, she asked me to bring her the shoebox of anniversary cards from the closet. We went through them together, slowly, her narrating each one from memory before I even opened it. You wrote this one the year the car broke down twice, she said, tapping a card without looking inside. You were so embarrassed. I didn't remember most of it as clearly as she did. I think she'd been holding on to all of it far more carefully than I ever had. She died a few days later. 3 months after the funeral, I finally opened her closet, found an envelope with my name on it. Only after you're ready to remove your ring. Inside, one line. Take it to Bennett Jewelers before you decide. What to do with it, I read it 3 times. The next morning, I put on my old jacket and went to find out. That's how I ended up at that counter, mocked by a stranger, watching Arthur Bennett turn my ring over and then go completely silent. This ring wasn't originally made for you, Arthur said. Not entirely. Your wife had it remade, the same gold, reshaped around something my grandfather built decades ago. He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn leather ledger, opened it to a page near the middle, turned it toward me. 3 lines, in 3 different hands, written decades apart. Miller, Margaret and Frank, 1979, returned, 2009 Margaret, 3 years ago. What happened in 2009? I asked. Your father-in-law came back. I felt the floor shift. He never spoke to me again after the wedding. He came to see my grandfather, not you. Arthur closed the ledger halfway. My grandfather was in his 80s by then. Still came in 3 days a week, mostly to sit near the window. Your father-in-law walked in, didn't say a word for almost a minute, just stood there. My grandfather recognized him immediately. He told me about it years later. He said the man looked like someone who'd been carrying something, heavy, for a very long time and finally wanted to put it down. What did he say? He asked whether you were still wearing it. My grandfather told him you hadn't taken it off once in 30 years. He knew because your father-in-law had asked a version of that same question. Quietly, more than once over the decades. Through people who knew people. He'd been checking. On you both for years. He just never let either of you know it. I sat with that a long moment. Your father-in-law sat in that chair. Arthur nodded toward the small chair by the window, for almost 10 minutes without saying anything else. Then he stood up and said, then I was wrong. My grandfather asked him if he wanted to tell you that himself. He said no. He said some things are easier to admit to a stranger than to the people you failed. I felt something in my chest give way. 30 years of a man quietly watching from a distance, never once letting Margaret know he'd been wrong, never once giving me the chance to know it either. And 3 years ago, Arthur continued, your wife came in herself, sat right there. The same chair, almost an hour before she said a word. What did she want? She asked me how small I could make the letters. Smaller than most people would ever think to look. What else did she say? Arthur paused, like he was deciding whether to tell me. She said, Frank thinks I settled for him. He shook his head. She laughed when she said it, not because it was funny, because she couldn't believe you'd spent 47 years believing something so completely wrong. My eyes filled. She touched the ring and told me, he still thinks the scratches are evidence of what he couldn't afford. Then she said they were evidence of something else. What? That you stayed. He handed me the loop. Look inside. I pressed it to my eye. At first, nothing. Just scratches. Old gold. Then I tilted it toward the light. 6 tiny words, smaller than a grain of rice, written in a handwriting I recognized instantly. Margaret's handwriting. 47 years wasn't long enough. I don't remember sitting down. Mr. Miller. I looked up. The woman who had laughed at my ring was standing beside me. Her husband hung back near the door. I owe you an apology, she said. You don't owe me anything, I said. She glanced at the ring. I thought expensive meant valuable. So did I said. For 47 years. Arthur offered to buy the ring that day. Real money, more than I'd ever seen in one place. I said no before he finished the sentence. It was never mine to sell. I put it back on and drove straight to the cemetery. Sat beside Margaret's headstone, held my hand up to the light even though I couldn't see the words without Arthur's loop. I didn't need to. I turned the ring slowly, the way Arthur had, and let myself remember what each mark actually was. The deep scratch on the side. From the winter I fixed the neighbor's furnace for free because they'd just had a baby. The dull patch near the seam, worn down from 38. Years of gripping wrenches and steering wheels, and toward the end, Margaret's arm as I walked her from room to room. Even the thin groove near the edge, the one I'd always assumed was just wear. I remembered now it was from the night I'd slid it off in a hospital waiting room, gripping it so hard in my fist while doctors worked on our youngest that I'd bent it slightly and never had it fixed. A few rows over, a young husband was fumbling to get a ring onto his new wife's finger, his hands shaking. She laughed. "It's okay," she told him. "We're not going anywhere." I sat very still. Margaret had said almost the same thing to me 47 years ago in a small church with 32 people in the pews. I looked at the scratched gold band on my finger. For 47 years, I'd thought its scratches were evidence of what I couldn't afford. Now I knew better. Every scratch was a year. Every mark was a morning. Every worn edge was a promise I'd kept. Margaret hadn't needed a newer ring. She'd wanted this one because it had stayed with us. And so had I. 47 years wasn't long enough, I whispered. I closed my hand around. "The ring, so I'll wear it for the years we didn't get."